Berlin, February 1943. The war had reached its turning point. The German capital was tense, its citizens uneasy. The Luftwaffe, once proud and confident, was now struggling to maintain control of the skies. The Allies had begun to strike deeper into Europe, and Berlin's once assumed invulnerability was cracking. On the night of February 20th, the air raid sirens were silent. The skies were clear and calm, with no sign of enemy aircraft. Anti-aircraft crews were at their posts, relaxed but watchful. Then, somewhere in the dark, a faint sound appeared, a soft, steady hum that didn't quite match the roar of typical bombers. At first, no one noticed. But as the sound grew louder, radar operators at Luftwaffe command centers began to pick up something odd. A single aircraft, moving fast, low, and alone. It wasn't part of a formation, and it wasn't flying the path of a bomber stream. To the Germans, this made no sense. No pilot in his right mind would dare approach Berlin alone, yet the mysterious blip on the radar moved closer and closer to the capital. In that aircraft, 2 RAF men were focused, calm, and precise. Their aircraft, the de Havilland Mosquito, wasn't made of metal like the others. It was made of wood, lightweight balsa and plywood, crafted by furniture makers back in Britain. It was faster than almost anything the Luftwaffe had, and it didn't need heavy armor or gun turrets. Its defense was its speed. That night, the Mosquito's mission wasn't to bomb factories or train lines. Its orders were far more specific and psychological. It was to fly directly over Berlin in broad defiance of German air superiority, to deliver a single message. The skies above the Reich were no longer safe. As the Mosquito roared closer, German spotlights began to search the skies. The pilots could see them sweeping in slow, like white arcs below. The gun crews, unsure of what was coming, prepared their flak. But before they could react, the aircraft was already there, cutting through the night air like a phantom. At the same moment, deep inside the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler was preparing to deliver a speech broadcast across Germany. It was meant to boost morale after Stalingrad's disaster. He was furious, paranoid, and desperate to restore confidence. Yet just minutes before his broadcast, the distant thud of anti-aircraft guns began echoing across the city. The Luftwaffe command scrambled to understand what was happening. Was it a full raid? Were the British attacking Berlin again? But no. Reports came in that there was just one aircraft. One single intruder had flown directly into the most heavily defended airspace in Europe, dropped its bombs near the radio transmission tower, and vanished before a single German fighter could intercept. The Mosquito had done its job. The bombs weren't meant to devastate, they were meant to disrupt. Hitler's broadcast was delayed, forcing the state radio to go silent for more than an hour. For the British, it was a symbolic victory. For the Germans, it was humiliation. The Luftwaffe was supposed to control the skies. Their radar, their defenses, their fighters, all of it was meant to keep Berlin safe. And yet, a wooden aircraft, built in secrecy by carpenters and craftsmen, had flown through their defenses, struck the capital, and escaped untouched. In that single act, the Mosquito proved something the Allies had long suspected. Germany's air defense was no longer infallible. The Reich was vulnerable, not just to destruction, but to embarrassment. But this was only the beginning. What happened that night would ripple through the corridors of power in Berlin and London alike. The Germans would demand answers. The British would see opportunity. And in the months that followed, the Mosquito would become more than just an aircraft. It would become a symbol of ingenuity, speed, and audacity, a ghost that haunted the Luftwaffe's pride. The night over Berlin was just the first strike in a psychological war that Germany couldn't win. In the aftermath of that strange February night, Berlin buzzed with confusion and disbelief. Luftwaffe officials gathered in emergency meetings, their pride stung by what had just occurred. One single British aircraft, an unarmored, unescorted intruder, had flown straight into the German capital, disrupted Hitler's national address, and returned safely to England. To many, it seemed impossible. To others, it was a warning. The Luftwaffe's early reports described an aircraft that appeared and vanished faster than radar could react. Some officers dismissed it as a fluke, perhaps a lucky British pilot who caught the defense network off guard. But intelligence analysts began to whisper about something else, a new kind of British aircraft, one that didn't behave like any they had encountered before. Back in England, the RAF's morale soared. At airfields across Norfolk, pilots and engineers of the Royal Air Force gathered around the returning Mosquito, its engines ticking coolly in the night air. The mission had been a success. No damage to the plane, no casualties, and an enormous psychological blow to the enemy. This was exactly what the de Havilland Aircraft Company had envisioned when the Mosquito was born. A fast, light, and daring bomber that could outpace anything the enemy sent against it. The Mosquito's creation was almost as daring as its missions. In 1938, Geoffrey de Havilland proposed building a bomber made almost entirely of wood, a concept that most in the Air Ministry ridiculed. A wooden aircraft? In an age of metal and armor? The idea seemed absurd. But de Havilland saw what others couldn't. Wood was lightweight, plentiful, and non-strategic. It didn't drain resources from aircraft factories producing Spitfires or Hurricanes. More importantly, wood could be shaped with precision, offering aerodynamics that metal couldn't easily match. The Air Ministry initially rejected the design, calling it unsuitable for modern warfare. Yet as the war dragged on and Britain's need for high-speed, versatile aircraft grew, they reconsidered. De Havilland's prototype, the DH-98 Mosquito, proved to be a revelation. It was faster than the Spitfire, could fly higher than most bombers, and was so light that it didn't need defensive guns. Speed was its armor. Its twin Merlin engines, the same as those that powered the Spitfire and Lancaster, gave it blistering acceleration. The first time RAF test pilots flew it, they couldn't believe how easily it outran interceptors. Soon, Mosquitoes were flying photo reconnaissance missions deep into enemy territory, capturing high-resolution images of cities and factories with uncanny precision. Others became bombers, capable of carrying a 4,000-pound cookie blast bomb directly to a target and escaping before German fighters could even scramble. But the most daring missions, the ones that truly terrified the Luftwaffe, were the daylight raids. In broad daylight, pairs of Mosquitoes would streak across Europe at treetop height, hit their targets, and vanish. They became known for surgical strikes on Gestapo headquarters, prisons, and communication centers. By the time the Mosquito first appeared over Berlin, its reputation among German pilots was already growing. Luftwaffe aces who once prided themselves on being hunters now faced a phantom that refused to be caught. Radar operators complained that the aircraft was too small and too fast to track properly. Ground gunners cursed as their shells burst harmlessly behind it. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, took the incident personally. His pride was legendary and fragile. The very idea that a wooden aircraft had flown unchallenged over Hitler's capital was an insult. In a fiery meeting at Luftwaffe headquarters, he reportedly slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy. The British knock together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory can build, and they give it a speed which we can't match." For the first time, Göring admitted publicly that Germany had lost its technological edge in the air. The Mosquito wasn't just a nuisance, it was a symbol of Allied superiority in design, ingenuity, and daring. Meanwhile, British command realized they had created something extraordinary. The Mosquito wasn't a one-trick aircraft, it was adaptable. It could serve as a bomber, a night fighter, a reconnaissance plane, even a pathfinder for heavy bombers. Its speed meant it could deliver precision strikes and still make it home when others couldn't. And so new missions were planned, bolder, deeper, more psychological. Berlin wouldn't be the last target. The RAF wanted to make the Mosquito a name the Germans would fear every time they looked at the sky. The Wooden Wonder had made its debut over Berlin. Now it was about to become the most versatile and feared aircraft in the war. The first Mosquito raid over Berlin was supposed to be a one-time demonstration, a symbol, a message of defiance. But the effect it had was far greater than anyone in London expected. Inside Germany, the psychological shock spread like wildfire. The newspapers were ordered not to report the event, yet word still traveled through rumor and whispers. An English plane flew over the Führer's city, and nothing stopped it. For the Luftwaffe, it was more than an embarrassment. It was a revelation that their once impenetrable airspace had cracks. Göring, enraged, ordered a full investigation. How had the Mosquito reached Berlin? How had it escaped? Radar stations along the route were interrogated, flak commanders blamed their crews, and fighter groups were accused of negligence. But the truth was simpler. The Mosquito was just too fast. In the weeks that followed, the RAF launched more Mosquito flights over Germany. These weren't massive bombing raids. They were precision strikes, often carried out by 2 or 3 aircraft at most. They hit broadcasting stations, Gestapo offices, and railway junctions, targets chosen not just for military effect, but for their symbolic value. One particularly audacious mission came just days after the Berlin intrusion. 2 Mosquitoes were ordered to attack a key Nazi radio station, while Reichsmarschall Göring himself was giving a speech. The timing was perfect. As Göring began his broadcast, the Mosquitoes appeared overhead. Explosions cut through the transmission, and the broadcast went dead. Once again, the German public heard silence where there should have been words of confidence. Göring's fury was beyond measure. He called the Mosquito a cursed wooden menace, and privately admitted that Germany had no aircraft fast enough to catch it. His engineers promised a solution: faster fighters, better radar, improved flak control. But none of it seemed to work. The Mosquito could simply appear, strike, and vanish. Each new raid deepened the humiliation. In January 1943, Mosquitoes bombed the Gestapo headquarters in Oslo. In September, they struck Berlin again, in daylight. The attack coincided with a speech by Joseph Goebbels, and once again, the propaganda minister was forced off air. To the outside world, these seemed like minor raids. But inside Germany, their impact was seismic. The Mosquito had become a ghost of Allied power, a reminder that no matter what the Reich claimed, its heart could be reached. The Luftwaffe tried everything. The Me-109s and F-190s, Germany's best fighters, were sent up to intercept. But the Mosquito's cruising speed, over 360 miles per hour, made pursuit nearly impossible. Even if a German fighter managed to climb high enough to engage, the British pilots would simply dive, vanish into cloud cover, and disappear across the channel. To the RAF, this was more than military success. It was psychological warfare at its finest. Each raid was carefully timed for maximum humiliation. When the Allies learned of a major Nazi speech, parade, or broadcast, Mosquitoes were sent to interrupt it. They weren't destroying cities, they were destroying confidence. By mid-1943, the Germans began referring to Mosquito attacks as terror raids, though few civilians were killed in them. The real terror came from knowing that the British could strike anywhere, anytime, and the Luftwaffe couldn't stop it. The Mosquito squadrons themselves were made up of some of the RAF's most daring crews, men who thrived on danger and precision. They trained to fly at treetop level, often so low that branches and debris struck their fuselages. Navigators had to be flawless, using split-second timing and terrain recognition to reach targets exactly on schedule. In the Mosquito, there was no margin for error, but also no hesitation. One pilot later described flying the Mosquito as riding a razor through the dark. You could feel every vibration, every gust of wind, but above all, you could feel the speed. The sheer rush of slicing through enemy skies with no one able to touch you. By late 1943, the Mosquito had become a symbol of Allied audacity. In British newspapers, it was celebrated as the plane that outflies death. But for Göring and the Luftwaffe, it was a constant reminder of defeat. He reportedly told his officers, "The British have built a plane that my engineers say is impossible. They have the spirit we once had." Each Mosquito that crossed the German border carried more than bombs. It carried a message. A message that even as Berlin tried to stand proud, the enemy could reach it with ease. The night the first Mosquito flew over Berlin, the Reich trembled. But what came after would be worse. For the Mosquito would not only return, it would do so again and again, until its shadow became a symbol of the Luftwaffe's downfall. By late 1943, the Mosquito had gone from a rumor to a nightmare. Its wooden wings haunted the German sky, silent, swift, and untouchable. The Luftwaffe had once dominated Europe's airspace, but now their proud reputation was unraveling, not under waves of bombers, but because of a single type of aircraft that mocked everything they believed in. And Berlin, the beating heart of the Reich, remained its favorite target. The RAF had realized that what one Mosquito could do to German morale, a dozen could do to history. New plans were drawn. Raids designed not just for destruction, but for humiliation. The Mosquito squadrons would strike when the propaganda machine was at its loudest. The more public the event, the more dramatic the blow. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, 3 Mosquito squadrons were assigned a mission of almost theatrical precision. The objective was not to destroy a city block or a military installation. It was to disrupt Nazi prestige itself. The first squadron, flying from Norfolk, was to reach Berlin exactly as Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring began his speech at the Berlin Radio Building. The second would arrive moments later, just as propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels was scheduled to speak from the German State Opera House. The third, flying in from another route, would attack secondary communication centers to ensure confusion. At dawn, the Mosquitoes lifted off from their bases, flying low over the North Sea. The crews navigated through cloud and flak belts, their aircraft loaded with small, high-explosive bombs, perfect for precision strikes. Each man aboard knew that this was no ordinary mission. They were about to challenge the German High Command, face to face, in their own capital. As Göring stepped up to the microphone in Berlin, radio listeners across Germany tuned in to hear his speech, a triumphant broadcast meant to reassure the people after months of bad news from the Eastern Front. But before he could begin, the air raid sirens screamed through the city. In the sky above, the first Mosquitoes appeared, slicing through the clouds at nearly 400 miles per hour. Within seconds, they released their bombs. Explosions thundered across Berlin, shattering windows and throwing the capital into chaos. Göring's voice was drowned in static. The broadcast went dead. Minutes later, Goebbels himself prepared to speak from the Opera House, unaware that the second wave was already on its way. As he opened his mouth to begin, the air shook again. Bombs rained down nearby, forcing him to take cover. The nation that was supposed to hear the Führer's ministers celebrating 10 years of power instead heard silence and confusion. Back in Britain, RAF crews listened to intercepted German broadcasts and could hardly contain their laughter. The mission had been flawless, timed to the minute. In London, Winston Churchill himself was briefed on the operation's success and reportedly chuckled at the irony. A few wooden planes, built by craftsmen and furniture makers, had embarrassed the most powerful air force in Europe. For Göring, the humiliation was unbearable. His personal reputation was tied to the Luftwaffe's supposed invincibility. Yet no matter how many orders he gave or how much rage he unleashed, he couldn't stop the Mosquitoes. Their speed made them ghosts. Their precision made them legends. Desperate to respond, the Luftwaffe attempted to design faster aircraft, like the Me-262 jet and the TI-152 high-altitude fighter. But production was slow, resources were scarce, and Allied bombing campaigns crippled factories before these designs could change the tide. The Mosquito remained untouchable. As 1944 dawned, the raids continued. The aircraft was everywhere, flying reconnaissance over the Ruhr, bombing submarine pens in France, even striking targets in Norway and Denmark. Wherever it appeared, German commanders were left furious and helpless. To the people of Berlin, the Mosquito became a symbol of inevitability, proof that the war was no longer in their favor. Ordinary citizens began to look to the skies at night and whisper, "Der Geist kommt wieder," the ghost comes again. For the British, the Mosquito had become more than a machine. It was a statement of ingenuity, that intelligence and craftsmanship could defeat brute force. Its wooden body, often mocked by skeptics, was now an emblem of defiance. One German officer captured the sentiment best when he wrote, "They built it from the same material as their violins, and it plays the same haunting tune." The Luftwaffe's frustration grew into despair. No interceptor could match the Mosquito's agility. No radar could track it long enough. Göring, once the master of the skies, now faced an enemy that didn't fight fair, because it didn't need to. And as the war turned against Germany, the Mosquito's missions only grew bolder. Soon, it wouldn't just be Berlin's broadcasts or propaganda centers under attack. The Mosquito would be assigned its most daring missions yet, to strike deep inside occupied Europe, to rescue prisoners, destroy Gestapo headquarters, and lead bomber streams into the heart of the Reich. The wooden wonder had started as a symbol of defiance. Now, it was becoming a weapon of liberation. By 1944, the Mosquito had transcended its origins as an experiment in wooden engineering. It had become legend, the most versatile, feared, and respected aircraft in the skies of Europe. What began as a single flight over Berlin had evolved into a relentless campaign of precision, speed, and psychological dominance. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the continent, was now drowning in exhaustion and defeat. Allied bombing raids darkened Germany's skies day and night, and the Mosquito led the way, literally. Acting as a pathfinder, it marked targets for waves of heavy bombers with astonishing accuracy, using radar and navigation equipment far ahead of its time. German radar operators would often report the first Mosquitoes arriving minutes before the main bomber stream, knowing what would follow, a storm of destruction they were powerless to stop. But the Mosquito wasn't just a bomber. It was everywhere, in every role, every theater. It scouted over Normandy before D-Day, mapping beaches and defenses. It photographed the V-1 launch sites in France, giving the Allies vital intelligence to destroy them before they could rain terror on London. It hunted U-boats, destroyed railway bridges, and even carried out some of the most daring precision attacks of the entire war. Among these missions, few matched the audacity of the Aarhus raid in Denmark or the Amiens prison raid in France. In both, Mosquito squadrons flew at rooftop height to deliver pinpoint strikes, not to destroy cities, but to free captured resistance fighters and political prisoners. On February 18, 1944, the Amiens raid, codenamed Operation Jericho, became one of the most extraordinary operations in air warfare. At exactly noon, Mosquito bombers approached the Amiens prison, where the Gestapo held more than 100 members of the French resistance. The plan was simple but terrifying. Blast open the prison walls and destroy the guard barracks to allow an escape. The Mosquitoes came in so low that their propellers sliced treetops. At 250 miles per hour, they dropped their bombs with surgical precision, shattering the outer walls and tearing holes in the guard posts. Within minutes, hundreds of prisoners escaped into the snow-covered countryside. The raid stunned both sides. For the Germans, it was yet another reminder that no place, no matter how fortified, was beyond the reach of the Mosquito. For the Allies, it was proof that the aircraft had evolved into the perfect tool for missions requiring both speed and compassion, a weapon capable of saving lives, as well as ending them. Back in Berlin, Göring and his commanders could only watch as the Mosquito continued to humiliate their once proud Air Force. Every new model seemed faster, deadlier, more efficient. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's remaining pilots referred to Mosquito encounters with a kind of grim resignation. "You don't fight the Mosquito," one pilot wrote in his logbook. "You endure it." As the war drew to a close, the Mosquito carried out some of its final missions against Berlin itself. In the last winter of the Reich, small groups of Mosquitoes penetrated the capital's shattered defenses, marking targets for Lancaster bombers. Even as anti-aircraft batteries barked into the sky, the wooden ghosts appeared, dropped their flares, and were gone before the shells reached their altitude. When the war finally ended in 1945, the Mosquito's record stood unmatched. It had flown more than 28,000 operational sorties in every major role imaginable. Its loss rate was among the lowest of any Allied aircraft. It had destroyed power stations, Gestapo headquarters, and airfields, photographed enemy territory from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, and performed some of the most precise raids in military history. And through it all, it had remained what it was on that first night over Berlin, an elegant wooden phantom that defied logic and expectation. The Luftwaffe, broken and bitter, admitted its defeat. The once invincible Göring had watched his proud fighter force reduced to ruins, while British carpenters and craftsmen working in small workshops across England had built the aircraft that outclassed them. In the post-war years, captured German officers often spoke of their respect for the Mosquito. One Luftwaffe colonel, interviewed in 1946, summed it up with weary admiration. "The Mosquito was the perfect enemy. It came without warning, struck without mercy, and left without trace." Back in Britain, the men who flew it rarely boasted. To them, the Mosquito was not just a machine, but a companion, light, alive, and loyal. Pilots often said that the aircraft seemed to sense danger, that its controls responded like thought itself. They called it the wooden ghost, the pride of de Havilland, and the plane that never let you down. When historians later look back at that first flight over Berlin, the night a single mosquito humiliated the Luftwaffe, they saw more than just a daring mission. They saw a shift in the entire balance of power. A symbol that victory was no longer about size or numbers or raw firepower, but about imagination, courage, and the will to innovate. In the dark skies over a city once considered untouchable, the Mosquito had written its legacy, not in the roar of engines or the flash of bombs, but in the silence it left behind. For on that night, and every night after, the Luftwaffe learned the same lesson over and over again. You cannot kill what you cannot catch, and you cannot defend against what you cannot see. The Mosquito, the wooden wonder, the ghost of Berlin, proved that sometimes the quietest weapon makes the loudest noise in history.